extraordinary panel of local experts who will join you on the panel. Please go ahead and come up now. You have printed biographies. That's so that we don't spend too much time reading them out loud. But immediately to my left is Antero Pietila, who many of you know as the author of Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City. And I think for many of us, predating the publication of The Color of Law, this extraordinary book summarized for us the longstanding housing discrimination practices in Baltimore City and in the region here. Next to him is Tony Fugett, president of the Baltimore County branch of the NAACP. Carolyn Johnson, managing attorney at Homeless Persons Representation Project. Destiny Watford with the Baltimore Housing Roundtable and the South Baltimore Community Land Trust, and Danise Jones-Dorsey, also with the Baltimore Housing Roundtable and the Northeast Housing Initiative. We're so delighted to have all of them here with us this evening. Each of them are going to share with you their particular perspectives and experiences and efforts to address housing discrimination in the Baltimore City and Baltimore County area. Antero is going to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much. Until the 1960s, all real estate ads in the Baltimore Sun, or Sun papers as they were called then, which dominated the market, were segregated by race. Houses white, houses colored, or restricted. Everyone knew what that latter category meant. No blacks, no Jews. Add to that traditions that went back to slavery times, when Baltimore was a sunset town where blacks outside their areas were to be off the streets after 9 p.m. or face arrest. Overall, you did not go to neighborhoods where you did not belong. That's why the Supreme Court's 1954 school desegregation ruling was so traumatic to many whites in the Baltimore area, the only big city that desegregated immediately and system-wide. Blacks were suddenly seen as violating their turf. During segregation, Pennsylvania Avenue was one area where the races met and interacted. Until the 1950s, the blocks above North Avenue were white, mostly older people, working-class Jews, even though the neighborhoods below North Avenue had become predominantly black. At night, Pennsylvania Avenue was the pulsating center of black nightlife. In the daytime, it was a busy shopping area with discount department stores that served all races, unlike the downtown stores. Another magnet was Lafayette Market. It was huge. Then all that changed. In 1953, a monster nighttime blaze destroyed Lafayette Market. All of its 219 stalls were destroyed. Some 75 nearby businesses were wiped out and dozens of residents displaced. The next year, 9 replacement stalls were swept by fire. Suddenly, the Pennsylvania Avenue crowds thinned out and the surrounding neighborhoods, black and white, were less desirable, except for real estate speculators known as blockbusters, who could profit from racial change they orchestrated. The fires were part of a rash of suspicious blazes at municipal markets and coincided with the spread of commercial supermarkets. The famous Lexington Market was destroyed in March 1949. Old Town's Bel Air Market was partially obliterated in May 1951, and Federal Hills Cross Street Market was incinerated 2 weeks later. None of these fires was solved. Then the Liquor Board took an action that further destabilized the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor. Months after the Supreme Court's 1954 school desegregation ruling, the Liquor Board issued an ultimatum. At that time, all bars and taverns were licensed to cater to only a specific race. Now the Liquor Board threatened to take away the licenses of any black bars in the Pennsylvania nightlife district that served drinks to white slummers. This sent a further signal to whites not to go to Pennsylvania Avenue. A dozen white bars also closed and wanted to be reclassified to serve only blacks because owners realized that their area was targeted for racial handover. All this was connected with politics, as I outline in my new book, The Ghost of Johns Hopkins. One of the liquor board's 3 members was Irvin Cohens, the Democratic godfather who launched the careers of Mayor and Governor William Donald Schaefer, as well as the House Speaker and Governor Marvin Mandel. So when we talk about the impact of redlining and blockbusting, we see those phenomena connected with actions by all kinds of local governmental players. The liquor board could put brakes on racial change by denying black licenses in certain areas, or it could speed up racial change through classification criteria. The same for municipal services like sanitation and garbage pickup. When we look at today's Baltimore, it is clear that racial fears are part of the reason for the abysmal public transit system. If we don't have a workable transit system, outsiders cannot get to areas where they don't belong. They also cannot get jobs. Or how about Greenmount Avenue? Across from the hoods on the east side are the mansions of Guilford, the most prestigious of upscale neighborhoods. But try to get to Guilford from Greenmount Avenue. All the access roads are blocked either by structures or because they are one-way out of Guilford. Baltimore truly is a city of neighborhoods. However, too often that means exclusion instead of inclusion, and still does. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Tony, I know that Baltimore County is not immune and yet very much affected.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Tony Fugett, and I'm the president of the Baltimore County branch of the NAACP. And as you know, the NAACP fights discrimination across a number of different areas, from education to the police department, to the fire department, to employment, and then housing. And I'm fairly new to the housing issue. The housing issue in our branch was initially initiated by our former president, Patricia Ferguson, and Mac O'Malley, who was the housing chair. And they started on this initiative based on the complaints that were coming across at housing. And we lost Patricia Ferguson to cancer, and I became president of the branch, and I had to carry the mantle that she had started in terms of housing. So I went into a crash course in trying to learn about housing. So I took a look, and I wanted to get a picture and understand the county that I live in, this county called Baltimore County. The first thing I noticed was that whenever you talk about housing, you tend to talk about the Baltimore region, okay? And if you're not from Baltimore, you would probably think that Baltimore City was the county seat. And we all know that that's not the case. But if you look at the numbers and the statistics, Baltimore County does an excellent job of hiding in the mass numbers that include Baltimore City. So let's look at what happens in Baltimore County. If I told you that Baltimore County was the most segregated county in Maryland, would you believe me? If I told you that every time that people attempt to find housing in certain areas of the county, they're directed towards the western part of the county if they're colored, if they're people of color, would you believe that that would happen? Okay, would you believe that when they talk about the voucher program, and you hear certain politicians saying we don't want people from the city coming to the county, would you realize that we're talking mostly white folks, and they're trying to migrate across the county? They're not trying to go into, if you would, people from the city to the county. It's just the opposite. There were more, if you would, people that ported from the, if you would, county to the city because they couldn't find housing. Okay, if you talk about the other thing in Baltimore County, they talked about public housing. Gee, that doesn't exist in Baltimore County at all. So you're at the mercy of the developers. And what motivates the developer? Money. Absolutely right. So they develop these programs, and they say if you develop certain types of housing, we will incent you to build them. And they go and they say, okay, we're going to do fair, we're going to do moderate price housing. They get it up, and then they say, oh, well, wait a minute, we're not going to do it. Guess what the penalty is? You have to repay the loan. But now you have an asset. So how difficult is it going to be to repay a loan? It's not with interest, it's not whatever, you just have to repay the loan. So they strategically do that. And then they look for things that they can do and do well. There was another area that you could address, which was senior citizen housing. And they did an unbelievable job of building senior citizen housing throughout Baltimore County. You can look at the Padonia Road corridor, you can look inside of Green Spring, you can look at all across the county in terms of where they've been able to accomplish that. And then the other thing that the county has a wonderful thing of doing is restricting areas. And the way that they do that is they make it well and septic, meaning that you can't really do a development unless you have the infrastructure to support it. So guess what? It's a protected area in certain areas. So we were looking at high opportunity areas, and we said, well, where are high opportunity areas where we could, if we would, put housing? And they said, well, you can look at Newtown because it's on the metro line and it's on the metro system. We said, well, wait a minute, what about the light rail? It goes to Hunt Valley. Well, why can't we find something along that corridor that we can address? And the battle, I guess, continues. And I was very fortunate to have people at my side who sort of guided me along the way. One of the individuals who did that is Victor Good, who was counsel for the NAACP and National, and he's here this evening.
Yeah, Victor.
And the other person who educated me quite a bit was Barbara Samuels, who's with the ACLU. And it's interesting in terms of the ACLU, you know, Baltimore County didn't have a history of having elected minority figures in Baltimore County. And literally we threatened to sue the county to create the district that created the first minority-controlled district that we could have an African-American on the county council, which, oh, by the way, in the county is a very powerful position in terms of what happens in that district. So Barbara gave me an education, and I said, Barbara, I said, you know, what am I up against? How many counties in America are as bad as Baltimore County? And she thought about it for a few minutes, and she said, 2 or 3. I said, whoa, no, you can't. She said, yes, 2 or 3. That's how bad it is. So the other thing she gives me is talking points. And it's kind of interesting. I had to speak at something, and she gave me a talking point, and this is the point that she gave me, and I'll conclude with this. For decades, affordable housing has been restricted to economically and racially segregated neighborhoods and excluded from white areas. A new book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Government Segregated America, spells this out in painful detail. And it's just delightful to be here tonight to hear you speak and talk about the history. And I thank you very much for listening to me this evening.
Thank you so much, Tony. And to the point of what can we do about it legally in Baltimore County, Carolyn, take it away.
Thanks. Tony and I have a lot in common because I too have been educated by Barbara Samuels. So I'm going to talk a little bit about legal strategy that we use to challenge longstanding and ongoing policies and practices in Baltimore County that we're not only failing to affirmatively further fair housing, but we're continuing to discriminate against African Americans and perpetuating racial segregation in the county. In 2011, an administrative complaint was filed against the county with the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development on behalf of several complainants, including the Baltimore County branch of the NAACP, Baltimore Neighborhoods Incorporated, and several individual residents. And I first want to give a shout out to the complainants in this case. What they did was really quite brave to participate. It's a very contentious, these issues are very contentious and very impassioned. And they really deserve a lot of credit stepping forward to participate in this kind of case. The complainants were represented by my office, HPRP, the Public Justice Center, Disability Rights Maryland, the Maryland ACLU, Maryland Legal Aid, and the NAACP. Lots of lawyers. And just a little bit of background on the demographics in Baltimore County and what we were looking at. Baltimore County is predominantly white, about 65%, about 25% black. And as Tony pointed out, highly segregated by race. They have a very high, what's called a dissimilarity index, which is a measure of racial segregation of 64.9, which means that 64.9% of African Americans would have to move in order to integrate the county. African Americans in the county have significantly lower income levels and are twice as likely to live below the poverty line. They're also overrepresented among renters for a lot of the reasons that you heard Mr. Rothstein discuss. So therefore, the lack of affordable rental housing results in restrictions in their housing choice and where they can live. African Americans were also more likely to live in larger families that need 3 or more bedrooms, yet only 18.5% of the rental housing in Baltimore County was 3 or more bedrooms. What the county was doing over time to create and perpetuate this racial segregation was we looked at their funding priorities and their housing development policies and practices. The county spent the vast majority of the federal funds it gets to develop affordable housing, home funds, community developed block grants, on-home ownership programs, and senior rental housing, which served, as Tony discussed, primarily white residents. The percentage of residents 65 and over who were white in Baltimore County was 90%, significantly higher even than the general population. So when they're building senior rental housing, they're building housing for white people. They had a policy restricted to only use some local tax incentives called pilots for senior rental housing, not for family developments. And then there was the infamous pocket veto. The largest project, the largest funding source to develop affordable rental housing is the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is funded by the federal government, but through a state agency. Baltimore County required, in order to get tax credit project approved to be built in Baltimore County, the developer had to obtain the support and approval of the local county council person in whose district the development was going to be sited, before they could even talk to anybody in the county about even thinking about building any housing there. This had a huge chilling effect on the development of family rental housing. All the new construction for low-income housing tax credit developments in Baltimore County for the 15 years prior to this complaint were senior-only rental housing. So during this time when they're actively refusing to build family rental housing, they're also actively participating and funding the demolition of over 4,000 subsidized rental units that existed in the county over this 15-year period, which housed predominantly African-American families. When they did these demolitions of these projects, these units were replaced with single-family homes and senior rental housing. One example of this was a project in Kingsley called Kingsley Park, 312 subsidized family units, 77% African-American, was demolished by the county and replaced with 115 single-family homes and 81 units of senior rental housing, using approximately $21 million of public funds. Not a single unit of family rental housing was replaced for that demolition, and that happened again and again and again and again and again. So as they're demolishing existing rental housing, not building anymore, that leaves the primary means for African Americans to obtain affordable rental housing in the county to be their Section 8 program. However, the program does not provide real housing choice, as the Section 8 vouchers are clustered and segregated in the county in high poverty or high minority concentration neighborhoods, or both. Baltimore County does not have a local law prohibiting discrimination based on source of income. Many landlords in Baltimore County do not rent to voucher holders. Many county legislators both, have actively opposed these laws, both at the state and local level. They also had a, they also were lacking in their fair housing planning. The federal government, as a condition for receipt of a lot of these federal funds, requires jurisdictions to engage in fair housing planning, to identify impediments to fair housing in the region, and to set out in writing solutions to those impediments. When we filed the complaint in 2011, their last analysis of impediments to fair housing was in 1996, and they hadn't followed anything that had been laid out in it. The plans in 1996 and then one that followed in 2010 specifically identified the lack of affordable housing for minorities in non-impacted areas as the primary impediment to fair housing choice in the county, and yet the county took no action to address the impediments and continue to certify to the federal government that it was in fact affirmatively furthering fair housing in order to draw down their federal dollars. So those were some of the things that the county was doing that gave rise to the complaint in 2011. The complaint was settled in March of 2016 through what's called a voluntary compliance agreement. I'm just going to list a few of the highlights of what's contained in the agreement. This agreement was signed, like I said, in March of 2016. It's a 12-year agreement. So the efforts are ongoing to ensure that they actually are going to do what they said they were going to do in the agreement. The county has to create 1,000 new hard units in areas of opportunity. 10% have to be accessible, 50% have to be 3 or more bedroom. The county is providing $30 million for the creation of these hard units from county money. They're creating a mobility counseling program that will place 2,000 housing choice voucher families in areas of opportunity. They will, and they have, eliminated the pocket veto, so developers no longer have to get the approval of the specific council member in the district in which they want to develop. The county executive is required to submit source of income legislation to the county council, and, quote, promote such legislation and oppose weakening amendments. The next county executive that will be sworn in January of 2018 must submit this legislation every year for the remainder of the agreement until it passes. Now, even though we have had success in getting this settlement, I have to say there still is a lot of opposition to this agreement in Baltimore County. There's community opposition, there's opposition among elected officials, and in fact, if you're following any of the elections in Baltimore County, there are some candidates who are actively campaigning against this agreement and against things like the source of income legislation. So we still, even when you win, there's still a lot of work to do to really turn things around in Baltimore County.
Thank you, Carolyn. And you do not have to be a lawyer to create great change in your community. And I'm so delighted to have Destiny Watford speak. Some of you may have heard her speak, or if you watched the press coverage of the Housing Trust Fund City Council hearings last week. She testified and she spoke at the rally outside. And Destiny, take it away. Share with us what you've accomplished.
Sure. I may sound a little nervous because I'm up here with like some people that I really look up to, and I'm trying to like not completely freak out. But my name is Destiny, and I wanted to talk to you guys about a movement that is happening in Baltimore right now that's fighting for community-driven development. and taking ownership over our neighborhoods that, as folks have laid out, have been neglected, and that we've been facing the consequences of for generations. But before I get into that, I want to talk a bit about how I got involved in this kind of work. So I'm a community organizer, and the way that I became a community organizer is about 5 years ago when I was in high school. I live in Curtis Bay. How many people have been to Curtis Bay? Whoa, that's so cool. Okay, that never happens. Usually folks' hands stay down. Wow, you guys threw me off. Okay, that's super cool. Well, usually people don't raise their hands, and people don't. About 5 years ago, if I were to ask these questions, people's hands would be down, and that's by design. Curtis Bay has a long history with poor developments, and specifically developments that put our lives at risk. So Curtis Bay and the Curtis Bay region has been treated as a dumping ground for generations. It used to be a company town. It's zoned for industrial. It's zoned industrial, despite people living there for years, for decades. And there's a lot of polluting industries, a sea of polluting industries that surround us. And because of this, we're forced to deal with high rates of asthma. I'm more likely to die of lung cancer because I live there. I'm more likely to suffer from respiratory disease because I live there, and a whole another kaleidoscope of respiratory-related illnesses. Some of my friends and neighbors have died from cancer because of the air pollution that we are forced to breathe in every day. And so the newest development that was proposed in my neighborhood was a plan to build the nation's largest trash burning incinerator. That would have been burning 4,000 tons of trash every day. It was permitted to release 240 pounds of mercury and 1,000 pounds of lead every year. And so when I and friends of mine, when we were in high school, learned about this, we decided that we wanted to take action to stop the incinerator. And this launched us into this whole world of organizing and talking to folks and researching and trying to make sure that this development doesn't happen. That was supported by our governor, who ran for president in 2016 on a green platform, it was supported by our previous mayor, and it was supported by Maryland law, right? Incineration is considered green in Maryland. And so we fought really hard in that campaign, and long story short, we won that battle. Yeah, that's not, thank you. Yeah, I could talk all day about the incinerator, but before we won the fight, we were trying to get at why was the one big question that came up through the campaign from the beginning was, why here? Why Curtis Bay? Why this place? And how can we actually stop another development like the incinerator from happening? Because it wasn't the first development of its kind. And the reality was that the reason the incinerator was proposed, the reason why it was proposed in our community, was because we don't have control over the land beneath our feet, because we're poor, because we're considered to be voiceless and useless and hopeless. Our lives don't have value to those in power. And so we realized that if we were going to stop developments like the incinerator that don't care about us, our health, our lives, or our future, then we were going to have to make decisions about the land in our community. And the way that we wanted to do that was through a tool called a community land trust, by doing community-driven development. And so we weren't alone in this, right? We had our own share of challenges with the incinerator, but Curtis Bay is also dealing with the fact that despite being a small neighborhood, we have over 500 vacants in our community. That's counted by the city. There's lots more, and some of them are older than I am. And so we found, like through the Baltimore Housing Roundtable, which Amanda and Terrell, if you're interested in getting more involved with, have sign-up sheets, please find them. We brought together like communities across Baltimore who are dealing with the very same realities, who have been suffering for generations and are tired of it. And so we built a campaign to create a new vision. We call it our 2020 vision, which calls for $20 million, $40 million from the city government for public investment into our communities that have been neglected and segregated, as folks have said, for generations. And one huge victory that we've had, or journey that I really want to share with you guys, is that the way that we want to do development in Baltimore is fundamentally different from the way that it is being done right now. We want to put power in the hands of residents who are most at risk, who are facing the consequences of these bad decisions that were made. And the way that we've built this power is through ballot initiative and getting thousands of voices and signatures to force the city to create an affordable housing trust fund, infrastructure that never existed in the city until we helped create it. And it's through, I'm summarizing a little, but it's through this fight and this ballot initiative that we were able to get the city, essentially force the city's hands to give us $20 million every year to create permanently affordable housing in Baltimore.
Wait a minute, hold up. Did you hear what she said? Let's affirm that.
That's right.
Yeah, it's an historic moment in Baltimore. This is not the same Baltimore that we were in a year ago or 2 years ago. And residents are the reason for that, or a part of that, and I'm really excited to share that. But the fight's not over, right? The status quo is real, and the big developers, wealthy developers that want to gentrify our neighborhoods, that want to push people out and continue this cycle here in the city, don't want this to happen, don't want us to get this money. And so something that I wanted to invite you all out to is a second reading of a bill that we have trying to pass through City Council. And that's going to be on October 15th at 5 p.m. Amanda and Terrell, could you guys stand up? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Have flyers. If you're interested in coming to that, please do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Destiny. And that is on October 15th, the second reader of the funding bill for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And please come and be a part of it. We'll all be there. And to talk more about the trust fund effort and a community land trust in Northeast Baltimore, Danise Jones-Dorsey.
Good evening. The good news is that because what has happened is de jure, which means it is man-made law, means that that law can be deconstructed by all of us in this room to create the kind of environment, housing that we want for ourselves and for our neighbors. 4 years ago, during the Lenten season, a group of people came together to reflect and to concern themselves with the justice issues in our neighborhood. We live in Northeast Baltimore, the Waltherson community, Bel Air Edison, Gardenville, Frankfurt, and so on and so forth. We were appalled at the number of houses that had been purchased by speculators and that were being rented to working people. A 2-bedroom house was renting for $1,200. A 3-bedroom house was being rented for $1,600. And even if an individual had a voucher, When they purchased that, when they rented that $1,600 home, their rent out of pocket was $1,000 plus utilities. We were also appalled at the structure that allowed folks to remain materially poor. We were concerned about the fact that no one was talking to persons to buy a house. Now think about it. If you can figure out how to do $1,200 a month, I think you could figure out how to buy a house. We were appalled that there was a deliberate, unspoken strategy to keep people from buying their homes. And the issue simply was this: if you are a working person and the average income in the Central Maryland, for those who are not from Maryland, that's Baltimore metropolitan area, is $45,000. If you have reasonably good credit, you can purchase a home for 3 times that amount of money. So that would be $135,000. The challenge is, in the city of Baltimore and in the county, Tony, where's the product? There's no home that you could purchase. So you are insidiously forced to rent, regardless of your race. You are forced to rent, and you are at that point destined to be part of the racial wealth gap. This group of people came together and heard about community-driven development. And we decided that, you know, we've got 6 grains of sense. We can figure this out. We just need some guidance on how to figure it out. And what we did was we wrote a tiny grant to the Catholic Campaign for Human Development to purchase a person to help us discern how we wanted to move forward as it related to community-driven development. In that discernment process, we decided to do a community land trust for home ownership in the 4x4 community, which is located near Gay and Bel Air Road, to develop housing for home ownership for persons who are 30 to 80% AMI. The naysayers have said that is absolutely not possible. Now, because I could talk a lot, I'm going to try to stay abbreviated, and let me just fast forward to today. The group, that band of community people, it's a small group, reaching out to a larger neighborhood, recently achieved the following. 1, we received funding to sustain our operational overhead. 2, we are looking towards the development of 18 houses for home ownership. 3, all right, go ahead. 3, we have 4 persons who have cleared all of the hurdles in order to get a mortgage. 4, we worked with PNC Bank, who has developed the mortgage product that can be used for community land trust housing, which is a major feat. They bore all of the financial responsibility and the legal risk to develop that product. 5, and most importantly, we have community members in the 4x4 community, members of Catholic High School, members in the greater Northeast area whose hope has been restored that we, the people, can lead and develop our communities in a way that is green, that is satisfying, that is diverse, that is fair, and most importantly, just. I'm gonna stop right there.
Thank you, Danise. That was the perfect ending. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up for questions. We're going to do questions for 5 minutes because it's just 7 o'clock. You're not going to lose time on your book signing. We've built in a little extra room on the other end, so don't panic. But we will open it up for questions from the audience now. In the spirit of hope, I have an initial question for Mr. Rothstein, but also for the panel. Last week, Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced a major piece of housing legislation, an omnibus housing bill, yes, woohoo, that includes both major funding for affordable housing and amendments to improve the Federal Fair Housing Act. I would love your thoughts on that particular bill.
Well, much as I admire Senator Elizabeth Warren, I'm not particularly interested in what she has in her bill, because there's no political support in this country at this point for doing the kinds of aggressive measures that we need to address this problem. And our first task has to be not to focus on legislation, but rather to focus on building the political movement that's necessary to force not Elizabeth Warren, but her colleagues to take this up. So I really want to emphasize that. Our task is a task of public education, of reaching out to neighbors, church members, people in our communities and our PTAs. That's what our task should be, and I think it's a distraction to worry about what kinds of legislation is being introduced, because it's not going to pass.
And I welcome other panelists are welcome to comment as well. Okay, all right, questions from the audience. Yes, Seema.
Thank you, everybody, for all of your wonderful comments. And I absolutely agree with your comment that it's really about having us in our hearts and minds actually integrate, right? The opposite of segregation is integration, and thinking about how can we actually look at our own neighborhoods right now and figuring out how we can integrate those neighborhoods where we live. And I was wondering if you had any examples of not necessarily through subsidy or through any policy, but really just making sure that your neighborhood itself is diverse. And I think maybe you had an example of that.
My recommendation would be to talk with your neighbors. Bring them together at the local coffee shop, in the library, in the supermarket, to talk about housing in their community and how they feel about housing, how they personally are impacted, and as that conversation evolves, connect them. I use the term link and leverage. Link them to groups who are working on the issues that they espouse. I do agree with Dr. Rothstein that it is absolutely important that we have a large dialogue about development and that we talk about community-driven development. That C in community is imperative. But again, it's real simple. Talk about it. Supermarket, service station, library, over a cup of coffee. The movement will begin.
Yes, back there.
I have a question. This is a hard one.
Go ahead.
Do you think investing in more police in Baltimore City, in our communities, that's going to change the violence of our young people killing each other? Do you think investing money in our communities could change that? And if so, could you talk to us about that?
Okay, I'll take that. I believe that the violence that we see in our communities, the opioid epidemic that we see in our communities, is a result of disinvestment in human beings. That disinvestment has to be reversed. So enforcement, public safety enforcement is not the answer. That's the Band-Aid on the wound, that we must do investment in human beings. And this particular conversation tonight is about investing in where people live. That's the first step, in my humble opinion, for reinvesting in the persons who live in our community. Dr. Rothstein talked about stress related to your physical environment, physical stress as well as emotional stress. So again, this conversation is very appropriate because unless we invest in human beings, and in this case, where they live, where they can relax, where they can de-stress, we will never be able to address the violence in our communities. And let me be crystal clear. Although in Baltimore, the folks that I see on the news look like me, the statistics says that everybody's involved and affected by violence. Did you want to go? You know what, now they getting ready to make this a monopoly up here. John, I don't know if I like that
The
or
other
not.
thing to consider is to broaden that question, okay? Because what tends to happen is you create this fear that it's going to move to Baltimore County and that it has a racial component to it, and they make you afraid of it. So it makes the housing issue even more difficult because they say, if you do this, you're going to bring crime to the neighborhood. So there's that fear factor that you have to consider in Baltimore County.
Well put. One last question. Yes?
So, how do we address the existing infrastructure that contributes to segregation in Baltimore? We spoke about the streets, we spoke about vacant homes, but how do we kind of take that step back and address those?
Well, let me take a shot at that. Recently, I guess it was a little while ago, there was an article in the Sun paper about an organization that bought a home. And they put a family in the home, and they had some responsibilities, and they got educated, and they did really well, and it was a successful outcome, okay? And the politician said, wait a minute, we don't want you to do that. We want to stop that. We want to know where you're doing that. We have a right to know if you're attempting to do that. So what that says is we have to find and adopt programs that work. And we have to educate, and we have to make sure that everybody understands that everybody has a responsibility in this. The homeowner, the tenant, the builder, everybody has a responsibility. And we need to identify programs that work and build on them. And that was a part of what the agreement was supposed to do. We said that if you could put those number of units in and the community could see that it was the right thing to do, that people would want to do more of the right thing. And that's really what it's going to take to make a difference in terms of housing.
I would just add that, as I mentioned earlier, we need to deconstruct those systems, modify those policies that perpetuate what we don't want. We also have to be clear that we're in this for the long haul. This is not going to happen in a year, 2 years, 5 years. This is a generational change. So your being present here tonight is a significant sign of hope for me as it relates to your investment in changing systems that we've already identified are broken or have an unintended impact in order to change how we want our communities to be reflected. I hope that helped.
Let me say something about the limits of the prescriptions that we talk about commonly. How we think that we can turn around community through public investment or by increasing home ownership, and I don't think that necessarily is so. If we want to see examples of failures of this concept, let's look at Sandtown. We have home ownership, and yes, there have been wonderful things achieved in the Sandtown community, but the failure of Sandtown is due to the lack of jobs, which is then due to the lack of transportation. And unless we address those problems, we are not going to address the community situation. Now, overall, I think that there are two criteria that any community aiming at stability has to meet, and those criteria are that they have to have access to conventional capital, investment capital, so that people can improve their homes. But equally important is the constant, steady rejuvenation of the community. You have to have young people moving in, because unless the houses are being brought up to date and made desirable, and a viable housing market exists, you will have increasing polarization and fear of the future. Any community that is in its ascendancy is going to be easier in terms of racial problems than a community that is in fear and is in declining status. And one of those communities examples is Roland Park. It's kind of interesting that Roland Park has this dark past as a segregated community, yet now that it is opening up, it is more vibrant and viable than it has been in many decades. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that we need to address, and the key ones are jobs and transportation. Without those, we are going to fight a losing battle.
Thank you. That is the final thought for this evening. Thank you so much to Mr. Rothstein, our panelists,